Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fair Housing Centers of West Michigan's Fair Housing 101 training for rental professionals. Thank you for being here. We will get started now. So I see people are still logging on, but due to time, we're just going to go on and get started. So, just some housekeeping things before we begin. Everyone is muted and everyone's cameras are turned off, so we cannot hear or see you. The session is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. If you have any clarifying questions about the content, please use the Q&A as there will be time at the end for detailed questions. We'll only take some Q&A questions if they're not scenario specific or anything during the presentation. We will take a break halfway through. Also, a little change to verify your attendance. We will still have an evaluation to complete on December 5th, by tomorrow, December 5th, by 5 p.m. And then you will receive an email that will verify your attendance. Please save this for your records. We will no longer be providing physical certificates. We'll be providing email verification. So please still complete that evaluation link at the end that we will provide, an attendance verification link, so you can still get that confirmation. And that should come up automatically in your browser. If not, we will be posting it in the chat, and then we'll follow up afterwards and send an email with the link to those who attended today. So welcome. My name is Brianna Miranda, and I am one of two education outreach coordinators. And joined with me today is Lindsay Owens. They are also another education outreach coordinator, and we will both be presenting today. And then we have Liz Keegan, who is behind the scenes helping with some technical assistance. So if any of your colleagues or anything are having issues, please have them reach out to Liz, and she can help. So we will have an agenda. We do have an agenda of just an intro, what is housing discrimination, an overview, go through the protected classes, the application of the laws, go over some testing, the equal housing logo, and we'll do some questions and then we'll end. So it'll be a pretty smooth class. So we will start out with a poll just to gauge where everyone is, because we do have folks, who have been attending these for years, and then we have new folks. So we're just wanting to see where everyone is. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. On a scale of 1 to 5, please rate your level of familiarity with fair housing, with 1 being I'm new, 3 being I have some knowledge, and 5 being I know a lot. I'll give folks about a minute to 30 seconds to a minute to complete that. All right, 10 seconds to get your answer in and where you fall on the level of understanding and familiarity with fair housing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. So get in your answers. Okay. I'm going to share those results. So we do have a mixed group. We do have quite a few new people with some sums, and yeah, we have a really good mixed group. So this is a 101, so I will be going through a little bit more of the basic stuff. So for those of you that are more experienced, hopefully that this is, kind of an update, a reminder of some of those that information. So we have another one here testing on the protected classes. Check all the protected classes under federal fair housing laws. So we have smokers, race, religion, sex, credit history, national origin, convicted felon, disability, adult with dependent children, and color. And should be a multiple choice question, or you should have the ability to choose multiple choices. Give folks about 10 to 20 more seconds. All righty. End that poll and share those results. So we're looking at federal fair housing laws and the protected classes within those laws. So the correct answers are, I agree with 98% of you. Race is one, religion, sex, national origin, disability. A tricky one, adult with dependent children is another way to say families with children. And then color. So the ones that are not federal protected under federal fair housing laws, smokers, credit history, convicted felon. And yes, sorry, I thought I skipped over one. So good work there. And then we have one more, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay. Well, three more technically, but three true and false here. Anyone can file a fair housing complaint, a resident, a visitor, or a property manager, true or false. Maintenance staff cannot be held responsible for stating a preference for certain types of tenants under fair housing law, true or false. And then the last one, a property manager has the right to inquire about whether opposite sex children under the age of 18 will have separate bedrooms, true or false. And I'll give a little bit of time for these ones because there's three there. Alrighty, I think I still see answers coming in, so I'll give about 5 more seconds here, get your final answers in, and we'll go over the answers. Alrighty, share those results. All right, for the first one, anyone can file a fair housing complaint. That is true. Anyone can file a fair housing complaint. We often have had the industry, making complaints about, fellow colleagues and stuff. So it can be anyone. Anyone can make a fair housing complaint. And we all have fair housing rights too. So maintenance staff cannot be held responsible for stating a preference for certain types of tenants under fair housing laws. This is false. So I agree with 86% of you. They can be held responsible. Anybody that is representing your company, your agency, your property, they can be held responsible for stating a preference. And the last one, a property manager has the right to inquire about whether opposite sex children under the age of 18 will have separate bedrooms. I agree with 71% of you. That is false. This can be considered familial status discrimination. So there is no right for a property manager to know about if opposite sex children are having separate bedrooms. Alrighty. Now I will turn it over to Lindsay, who will be kicking us off about who is the Fair Housing Center.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Bree. My name is Lindsay Owens, and I am an education and outreach coordinator at the Fair Housing Center in West Michigan. I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization. Then I'll get into basic fair housing protections and laws before we spend some time later in this training focusing on each protected class in more depth. So about our organization, the Fair Housing Center West Michigan, or our acronym FHCWM, is a private nonprofit fair housing organization founded in 1980. Our mission is to ensure fair housing choice and equal access to housing opportunities for all. We work towards this mission by providing comprehensive fair housing services, including education, like what you all are receiving today, outreach in our communities, doing research on lending and other fair housing topics, advocacy, and enforcement. Core to our work is the understanding that where you live impacts how you live, impacts our job opportunities, our access to healthcare, what kind of schools we go to, all sorts of things in our lives. So the ability to choose housing free from discrimination is vital. Before we get deeper in today's presentation, I wanted to provide a few disclaimers about our organization. The Fair Housing Center does not have attorneys on staff, and therefore we cannot provide legal advice. All information shared in today's presentation is for educational purposes only, again, not legal advice. Additionally, all information in this presentation is current to the best of our knowledge, but it could change at any time. Just want to leave you with those disclaimers. Part of the Fair Housing Center's work is to provide fair housing education in our communities to members of the housing industry like you all, home seekers, and the general public. Without the cooperation of members of the housing industry, we would not be able to accomplish our mission. We really rely on self-policing and personal commitment to fair housing rights and responsibilities. So that is why it's important that you all are taking this training today, and we thank you for being on today. The Fair Housing Center also does work around fair housing advocacy and enforcement. Enforcement often involves taking in complaints of discrimination, investigating, analyzing information, and working towards a resolution. Ideally, enforcement would not be necessary, but sometimes the laws and the education we provide are not always enough to ensure equal housing opportunity for all in our community. So that's why we have an enforcement wing to our organization. Sometimes with the words fair housing in our organization's name, it can be confusing for a lot of people not familiar with our organization to understand what exactly we do. Like I said a little bit earlier, and I'll get into fair housing laws in a bit, the Fair Housing Center works to ensure fair housing choice and equal access to housing opportunities for all. We'll get a little bit more into what exactly fair housing is in a moment, so please bear with me. But the following areas on this list are things that our organization does not do or does not exclusively do. So we don't address landlord or tenant law or matters. We don't teach homebuyer classes. We don't teach credit counseling. We don't strictly work on affordable housing issues. We don't handle building code and maintenance issues. We don't do foreclosure prevention, and we don't offer housing or refer housing. So those are some things that we don't do that can be kind of a helpful list to figure out if your question might go to us or it might go to someone else. And of course, we'll help you get to the right place to answer some of your questions. Our organization receives funding through contracts with the city, different cities in our service area, different counties, state and federal governments to provide fair housing services. We also bring in funding through our annual membership drive, our annual fair housing workshop series, consulting and private training, special projects, and senior millages. Several different organizations across the state of Michigan offer fair housing services, including the Fair Housing Center Metropolitan Detroit, Fair Housing Center of Southeast and Mid-Michigan, Fair Housing Center of Southwest Michigan, and then us, Fair Housing Center West Michigan. And we are in the kind of tealish blue color, the western area that includes the UP. That is our service area. So if you contact us and you aren't in our service area, will kindly help direct you to a service area that can help you.
Yeah, I just also really wanted to add really quickly. I know we have some folks from out of state, and we can only provide information on laws within our service area and understandings within our service area. So if you are located outside of Michigan, we aren't really familiar with those laws, so make sure you check with your local fair housing center. Just wanted to add that because I know there's a couple of folks from surrounding states.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And we'll get a bit into some of the fair housing protections now. And some of you might live in municipalities that we don't cover in our service area or live out of state. So definitely make sure you are able to determine what fair housing protections apply to you. So we can move to the next slide. Fair housing is the right of individuals living in the United States to choose housing free from unlawful discrimination based on protected classes under federal, state, and local fair housing laws. Fair housing protects people from discrimination, any housing transaction, including rentals, sales, lending, insurance, and more. These are the list of protected classes. We have protected classes under federal laws that applies to the entire United States. We have protected classes under the state of Michigan that covers the entire state of Michigan. And then we have local laws that vary. So I'll get into each of those, and then we'll get into more of the local laws and other applicable laws on the next few slides. But at the federal level, race, color, religion, sex, disability status, familial status, and national origin are all protected. So in case you don't know, color refers to skin color. Disability status includes any mental or physical disabilities. Familial status is defined as the presence of children under the age of 18 in the home or pregnancy. And then national origin is where you or your family are from. In addition to the federally protected classes, in Michigan, we have an expanded definition of race that includes traits historically associated with race, such as hair texture and protective hairstyles. We'll get a bit more into these in the coming part of the presentation. The state of Michigan also has protections for age, with some exceptions for certain types of senior housing. Michigan also has protections for sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, marital status, and then new this year, Michigan has protections for source of income and rental housing. So we'll talk a bit about those in the next few slides. And then locally in West Michigan, protections vary by municipality. So if you're interested in learning more about some of the protections in the municipalities where you live, especially if they're outside of our service area, check out some of these resources, Municode and American Legal, to kind of figure out what might apply to where you live or where your properties are located. A central aspect of fair housing laws and housing discrimination is the idea of differences of treatment. Fair housing laws require that each person is treated in an equal way in a housing transaction, regardless of a protected class like disability status, race, familial status, and more. It's legal for a person to be treated differently because of a protected class. So when we're thinking about fair housing and housing discrimination, there needs to be that difference of treatment there. It's illegal for people to experience differences because of a protected class in some of the following areas. So things like advertising, steering, which is guiding someone towards certain housing opportunities instead of others, eligibility criteria, applications, the documents, processes, policies, terms, conditions, discounts and specials, maintenance, access to amenities affiliated with the housing, and then harassment, which can look like intimidation or sexual harassment. And then the types of housing that's covered includes this whole long list: apartments, whether they're leased or rented, houses or condos, whether they're sold, leased, or rented, housing construction sites. This includes empty lots intended to be used for housing, homeowners associations, mobile and manufactured home developments, insurance, rooming houses, transitional housing and homeless shelters, residence halls, PHAs, cooperatives, group and adult foster care homes, nursing homes, assisted living, rehab facilities, just a whole long list. It even includes extended stay hotels that are used as a residence. So in a lot of cases, when there is housing, it's probably covered under fair housing law. Moving into some of the national trends that we're seeing. This year, the National Fair Housing Alliance released a report on data from 2024 and found that there were 32,321 fair housing complaints received by fair housing organizations like ours, and then federal and state agencies. This was a drop from the amount of fair housing complaints received in 2023, but we did want to note that there was a 5% drop in agencies available with the capacity to receive complaints, so that could be a reasoning for some of the drop in complaints. Nationally, the highest number of cases was based on disability status at 55% of all housing discrimination cases nationwide. Race is the second largest number of cases at 16%. And then moving into some of the local fair housing trends that we're seeing. Last year, the Fair Housing Center West Michigan had a total of 168 allegations of housing discrimination in 142 cases. We received over 300 allegations of discrimination that were reported to us in 2024, but for a variety of reasons, not all of these allegations became cases. The top area of allegations were based on disability status, race and color, and national origin. And also in 2024, the largest number of allegations by transaction came through rentals at 46%. This is why it's essential that all housing industry professionals, especially those in the rental industry, get education on and understand fair housing laws, protections and responsibilities that they have. Additionally, the next largest number of allegations by transaction were related to disability-related accommodations, sales, and mortgages. So it's really important that people in the housing industry get education. So we're really thankful that you all are on today and getting some education. Given all the things we've already discussed this morning, some of the fair housing trends, why should fair housing matter to people in the housing industry? We know that many of you all recognize and hold similar values to the Fair Housing Center West Michigan, the importance of equal housing opportunity, and that no one should face illegal housing discrimination. Housing discrimination has negative effects on our communities. It often limits the ability for some protected class groups to get housing, and this unnecessarily limits the market for housing and can have not great detrimental economic impacts on our communities. But aside from potential shared values, fair housing is also the law. Discrimination based on classes protected under federal, state, and local laws is illegal. A housing industry professional or provider's intention to discriminate is not required to be found liable for illegal discrimination, and ignorance is not a good defense for violating fair housing laws. So it's really, really important that people get education. Now that we've covered kind of the basics of fair housing, some trends, why it's important, we're going to start diving into specific fair housing laws. First, kind of the history and background, and then we'll get into more in depth on some of the protected classes. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the Civil Rights Act of 1870 are considered the Reconstruction Acts. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 says all persons in the United States have the same rights as white persons, and all persons have the full and equal benefit of all laws as enjoyed by white citizens. These are kind of some of the first laws in our country about protecting people's right to fair housing. This is not the Fair Housing Act, but these laws have protections for race. They're not the only laws that do, but protections for race and housing. Under the Reconstruction Acts, discrimination based on race is absolutely prohibited. So that is one thing to take away from the Reconstruction Acts, but there's also protections for race and other laws as well. So we are going to watch a short film produced by, I believe, Nationwide for the National Fair Housing Alliance's 30th anniversary, and it's going to kind of detail the 7 days after the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, that includes the Fair Housing Act and what led up to the Fair Housing Act being passed.
Few in the nation believe that fair housing would in our time become the unchallenged law of this land. And indeed, this bill has had a long and stormy trip. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing anything.
Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
The death of the prophet of nonviolence set off the worst outbreak of arson, looting, and criminal activity in the nation's history. Washington's ghettos burned within a few blocks of the nation's capital.
The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. And no words of mine can fill the void of the eloquent voice that has been stilled. But this I do believe deeply. The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him.
President Johnson was willing to speak up and say, we have to pass a fair housing bill.
Hello, Mr. President. Yes, sir. We're in trouble. We need some help. Yes? I'm afraid of that.
Federal troops, for the first time since the Civil War, took up positions to guard government buildings.
Nothing's probably touchier than your own neighborhood and your own home or your own apartment. The administration, which supported the bill, said this has no chance. The other stuff is okay, but this will kill any politician that touches it.
Well, I just could not live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed. But I moved here because it was a white community. I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out. I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they're allowed to move in here in any number.
It seems as though our country is pulling apart into separate societies, where whites have jobs and Negroes have unemployment, where the middle class lives in suburbs and the poor are left in the ghettos, where one group of Americans looks upon another group of Americans with growing mistrust and even dread.
Then the bill went over into the House Rules Committee, and under the chairmanship of the famous Judge Smith, right-wing segregationist from Virginia, he wouldn't hold hearings on it. He would take the bill home so nobody could act on it. And we were running out of time.
Thousands flowed through the rainy streets of Memphis this day, finishing a march that Dr. King planned to lead in support of striking garbage workers.
How many men must die before we can really have a free and true and peaceful society?
For your presence, Lord. And I know you'll reach out and take mine. You take our hand.
death of Martin Luther King is a tragic thing, but no legislation should be passed as a memorial to anyone.
In spite of the riots, I am going to support this legislation with all the vigor that I possess.
The laws that we pass up here are for all time. Martin Luther King's come and go.
The public reaction to this horror gave the sensible members of the committee a compelling argument that the House Rules Committee had to report that bill out. And I think that's how we got our bill. They just didn't dare bottle it up any longer.
And I have a dream that one day Negroes will be able to buy a house anywhere that their money will carry them.
At long last this afternoon, fair housing for all is now a part of the American way of life. Democracy's work is being done, and the bell of freedom rings out a little louder. We have come some of the way, not near all of it.
Fight still goes on because we unfortunately have the laws, but we don't have the enforcement. That we have changed, but we still have the same kinds of discrimination.
The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights said today that efforts by federal agencies to end housing discrimination have been generally superficial or incomplete.
President Carter has ordered federal agencies to use all means possible to strengthen fair housing programs. For the first time, people with disabilities and families with children will be protected from housing discrimination.
President Reagan signed legislation today designed to toughen up the nation's fair housing laws.
Why did you take part in this demonstration today? Just because there was a huge crowd, or did you have any personal reason?
Well, I took part in this march today because of Martin Luther King and what he stood for, because this march is what he died for.
Do you know what he stood for?
Yes. He stood for nonviolence and peace for all men of all kinds. And I think if he died for it, I could carry out what he started.
Hopefully, most of you were able to see that video and hear it. I think a few of you weren't able to hear it. So I think Liz posted the YouTube video in the chat. So if you want to watch that sometime later, feel free. So as the video detailed, 7 days after the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Civil Rights Act of 1968, including the Fair Housing Act, was passed. This act did not change protections under the Reconstruction Acts, and at the time it was passed, included protections for race, color, religion, and national origin. It made it unlawful to make, print, or publish any notice, statement, advertisement of the sale or rental of housing that indicates any preference, limitation, or discrimination based on these protected classes. In 1974, the act was amended to add sex as a protected class, and then in 1988, it was amended to add disability status and familial status as protected classes. And then for Michigan, laws in Michigan related to fair housing, a state law was enacted similar to the Federal Fair Housing Act to include all the federally protected classes. And then in Michigan, we also have the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act of 1976, or we call it ELCRA, the acronym, which includes marital status, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, source of income in rental housing, an expanded definition of race as protections. We'll talk a little bit more about those protections in the next few slides. Additionally, in Michigan, we have the Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act of 1976. This is similar to federal disability protections. It puts a greater burden on landlords in the state to make reasonable accommodations and modifications for people with disabilities. And then for some recent Michigan law updates, in 2023, Michigan expanded the definition of race under ELCRA through the Crown Act, which stands for Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair. It was signed in June of 2023, effective immediately. It added this definition of race to ELCRA. Race is inclusive of traits historically associated with race, including but not limited to hair texture and protective hairstyles. For the purposes of this definition, protective hairstyles includes, but is not limited to, hairstyles such as braids, locks, and twists, and more. The Crown Act also added definitions of gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation to ELCRA. Gender identity or expression means having or being perceived as having a gender-related self-identity or expression, whether or not associated with an individual's assigned sex at birth. And then sexual orientation means having an orientation for heterosexuality, homosexuality, or bisexuality, or having a history of such orientation or being identified with such an orientation. In 2023, in March, the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act was amended to include those previous definitions of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression as protected classes. And then that went into effect in 2024, so last year. The Michigan Department of Civil Rights does accept complaints for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And then earlier this year, source of income in rental housing protections went into place in Michigan. Source of income includes benefit or subsidy programs, including housing assistance, housing choice vouchers, public assistance, veterans benefits, Social Security, supplemental security income, retirement programs, and other programs administered by federal, state, local, or nonprofit entities. These protections went into place in April of this year. Landlords are still allowed to require certain income amounts to rent a unit, but they cannot specify the source of that income. The source of income does need to be legal and ongoing, and it cannot include income derived in an illegal manner. There is an exemption for small landlords with fewer than 5 units in the state of Michigan, and then housing agencies tasked with handling vouchers need to approve applications within 30 days. This is a really brief overview of source of income protections. We will get into more in-depth overview of these protections. We know you all might have a lot of questions about them, but we will talk about these more in depth in the later half of this presentation. There are exemptions to fair housing laws if the owner or a member of the owner's immediate family resides in one unit in a duplex, and that's the only property they own. Regardless of exemptions, all housing providers are prohibited from advertising or making statements in a discriminatory manner. We will talk a little bit more about this later on. Some of the local protections in the Grand Rapids area include genotype in Grand Rapids. This is kind of like your genetics. Height and weight are protected in East Grand Rapids, Kentwood, and Wyoming. And then medical condition is protected in Grand Rapids. You do want to know, I don't think I've mentioned that a lot of the protected classes also apply to other areas aside from housing. So that's why you'll see things like genotype, which might be more specific to a medical setting or context. But if anyone's asking about genotype as a housing provider, you should not be asking about that. I don't know why people would need that information. So those are some of the local protections in the Grand Rapids metro area. And then local protections along the lakeshore include education as a protection in Holland, and then height and weight as protections in Muskegon Heights. In Traverse City, height and weight are protected. We're covering mainly the places in our service area and then some larger places as well. In Ann Arbor, this is not in our service area, but we know there may be some people on the call today from Ann Arbor. There's a range of additional protected classes that they have. This includes things like arrest records, educational association, family responsibilities, genetic information, height, HIV status, political belief, and much more. So this is just an example of how much local protections can vary. We don't have some of these protections in the Grand Rapids metro area and in some areas of our service area. So it's really important that you all make sure you know what local municipal protections apply to you because they can vary so much. And then similar in Kalamazoo, which is not in our service area, there are protections for educational affiliation, being a victim of domestic violence, personal identification method, prior arrests, and conviction records. So definitely make sure you know what laws are applicable to your properties. Because laws can vary so much, it's important to check out these resources. If you have questions, feel free to contact your local fair housing center or check with your local municipality to make sure you know what applies to you. Something that we've seen emerging across our state are ordinances focused on protections for people with criminal records. Fair chance legislation has been proposed several times in the Michigan legislature, but it has not passed. If passed, it would prohibit a landlord from considering an applicant's criminal history during the tenant screening process. Similar ordinances to fair housing chance ordinances have been passed in municipal levels in cities like Ann Arbor, Detroit, Jackson, and Kalamazoo. So really, again, make sure that you know what local protections apply to you and your properties. Okay, I'm going to launch a quick poll. Okay, it should be appearing on your screen. Do you know if your property receives any federal funding? This is a helpful question because some properties that receive federal funding have more laws that apply to them that we'll talk a little bit about. So I'll give people about 30 more seconds to answer. Do you know if your property receives any federal funding? Okay, maybe 5 more seconds. I see some people's answers in the chat as well. Okay, I will end the poll and share the results with you all. So it looks like 64% of you said yes. So we're glad that you're on today. And there's some other laws that might apply to you as well as properties that receive federal funding. And then for the 20% of you that aren't really sure, make sure you figure out the answer to that question after this training today. Okay, we will dive into the next section. So some other laws that are applicable in the fair housing realm include the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA is the acronym. VAWA provides specific protections for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. Domestic violence cases have also been successfully filed under the sex protections of the Fair Housing Act. Victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking cannot be denied admission or federal rental assistance just because they are or have been a victim or threatened victim. Victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking cannot be evicted or lose federal rental assistance just because they are or have been a victim or threatened victim, and they cannot be denied admission or rental assistance, evicted, or lose their subsidy for reasons related to abuse, such as bad credit history, and criminal history. VAWA applies to those who are applying for or are tenants in any of the following programs, including public housing, Section 8 housing choice voucher programs, Section 8 project-based housing, Section 201 housing for the elderly, Section 811 housing for the disabled, Section 236 multifamily rental housing, Section 221D3 below market interest rate, continuum of care programs or COC, emergency solution grant programs, home, housing opportunities for persons with AIDS or HOPWA, housing trust funds, McKinney-Vento Act, homeless programs, rural development, multifamily housing, and LIHTC or low-income housing tax credit housing. VAWA requires that communities honor abuse protection orders and other court orders such as divorce decrees that address access to or control of the unit. VAWA requires that communities inform individuals of their rights under VAWA, including information to lease info in their lease agreements. And in cases where both the victim and perpetrator are parties to the lease, VAWA permits the community to bifurcate the lease in order to evict the perpetrator and allow the victim to remain housed. Linked here we have the Michigan State Housing Development Authority or MISHDA's VAWA page for some more information. There are some things that housing providers should not do when it comes to domestic violence. They should not deny admission based on an individual status as a victim of domestic violence. They should not evict a victim of domestic violence based on an incident or actual or threatened violence. They should not terminate a lease based on criminal activity directly related to domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking, unless the community can demonstrate an actual or imminent threat to other tenants or those employed at or providing services to the property. Housing providers can assist victims with domestic violence by making sure all their properties are well lit, safe, and secure, by completing repairs that may pose a safety issue, such as broken windows and locks in a timely manner, by acknowledging domestic violence protection orders and helping to enforce them, by excluding the violent person from the premises, by assisting in pressing of criminal charges, by not publishing victims' addresses in newsletters or giving out information to anyone without a release from the tenant. And they can also assist by recognizing that domestic violence is not a lease violation. Some other laws to be aware of in the fair housing realm include Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, Title VI, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and Housing for Older Persons Act. Section 504 is a law that protects qualified individuals from discrimination based on their disability. Title VI prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act is a federal law that prohibits creditors from discriminating against an applicant because of their race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, or age, because they receive public assistance, or because an applicant's previous good faith exercise of any right under the Consumer Credit Protection Act. And then Housing for Older Persons Act has specifications that housing must meet to qualify as senior housing. So those are some general other laws to be aware of. We'll talk a little bit more about HOPA, I believe, later on in the presentation. And lastly, we want to note that only the groups specifically listed under federal, state, and local fair housing laws enjoy protection under the law. All other classes are not protected. Here in our service area, things like bad credit, criminal history, and tattoos are not protected, but they could be protected in other municipalities. So again, it's important to do that homework to figure out what protections apply to some of your properties. And then now, before I turn it over to Bree for her to talk a little bit about advertising and fair housing, I want to make sure we address any applicable questions. Are there any questions, Bree?
Yeah, we do have a question about source of income. And as Lindsay said, that we will cover it in the second half of this presentation about consistency of the income. The law does state that it has to be legal and ongoing income. However, ongoing isn't, I'm not familiar if it is defined on what ongoing exactly means. So for the person that asked about inconsistent income from a business, it I would have to look into that a little bit more. And then we have another question. Can a victim of domestic violence end their own lease early if the perpetrator does not live there? I think it depends on some other factors. If there's a risk of safety element. So I think it depends on the factors surrounding the situation for the victim of domestic violence. Which you're welcome to reach out to us after the training if you have very specific questions that you would like some information on or best practices or just to get our thoughts on. So you're welcome to reach out to us afterwards. Our emails were provided in this presentation, so please feel free to do so.
Okay, I'll turn it over to you, Bree, to discuss a bit more about advertising. Or I
Yeah.
guess do a poll.
Yes, poll first. Yeah. So yes, we will start off with a poll. Really want to keep you guys awake here on this early Thursday morning. So this is an advertising poll. A newspaper or online ad that describes the type of person a landlord wants to rent to is acceptable under fair housing laws. True or false? So if a newspaper or online ad describes the type of person you'd like to rent to, is that acceptable under fair housing laws? True or false? Give folks about 30 seconds. Alrighty, get in your answers, and I'm going to end the poll here. All right. And yes, 93% of you are correct. That is false. Under fair housing laws and as a best practice, with any advertising, it is crucial to describe the property and not the people. Describing the type of people that you would like at your in your housing may open you up to fair housing risk. So we always, as a best practice, describe the property and not the people. And we'll go into that a little bit as we look at some ads and whatnot. Okay. So fair housing and advertising, it is discriminatory to advertise under the Fair Housing Act. Not only is it unlawful to make, print, or publish, or cause to make, print, or published, it is also illegal, or it is also prohibited under the Fair Housing Act for not only promotional materials, but verbal statements to be made that are discriminatory. Some potential statements that we have heard that would have potential fair housing risk. This home would be ideal for an elderly couple that would have some age discrimination or even familial status or marital status. There's a few. Perfect for one adult. Enough space for the hardworking downtown couple or awesome spot for one person. Ideal for two singles or a married couple. Looking for people preferably over 45. So again, these are all describing the type of person that they would like to have. And again, there's multiple, all these statements have some sort of fair housing risk associated with them. If it, as I said, age, marital status, familial status, and the one for 45 there's only two acceptable ages, which we'll go over, but it's 55 and older, and 62 and, or 60 and older, 62 and older. Sorry, 62 and older. And then here's some more. For one or two people or a couple with a max of two children. Again, we'll talk about occupancy, I believe, but in this session, but having a max of the number of people that also opens up to fair housing risk. Ideal for a college student or a single person, great for single person or retired couple. You must be clean, no drugs, no criminal history. If you feel you qualify, please respond with your brief description about yourself, race, age, and a recent picture of yourself. That last one actually did come from a case, and there was some discrimination that came of that case, or there was some discrimination that was found through that case. But yes, that never ask for a picture of anybody. Don't ask people to describe themselves. That really may open you up to fair housing risk. When you have targeted advertising, there's also fair housing risk there. In many ways, you could be denying people information about housing opportunities, targeting vulnerable consumers for predatory products or services, discouraging or deterring potential customers. Maybe there's different prices or conditions being advertised to different folks, steering folks to different neighborhoods, charging advertisers higher amounts to show ads to some consumers and not others. So again, that equal treatment is absent when we're looking at the targeted advertising. Not everybody is getting the same information. New technologies can be used to target advertising towards some consumers and away from others. So it can, some examples, having ads in predominantly Black neighborhoods that have notices of no criminal records and good credit only, but then ads in white neighborhoods don't have that type of language. So again, that difference of information, terms being provided outward. Targeted mortgage ad for men that has detailed information on current rates, but the ad for women says getting a mortgage is easy. Again, providing that difference of treatment. Women are not getting the current rates, whereas the men are in that situation. This was an actual ad. It is a interesting one. As you read it over, I just kind of want you to think about if the image or what you gather out of this housing opportunity, is this a place you want to live? Do you know about the bedrooms? You know about the layout of the home? Do you know if there is trash included, things like that? Do you know about the housing? So it states, they said I would have to mow grass and they take care of everything. They didn't warn me about the thin walls, late night banging, insomnia, and the smell of cumin, curry, and oregano in the halls. Apartment living is oxymoronic. I want my own space, a place that expresses my unique personality and lifestyle. And then it just goes on. I, again, don't understand this ad personally with the Yoda and the eggs, but just thinking about this ad, do you get anything out of this that is about the housing opportunity? If you were looking at this, would you say, oh, yeah, this is the place I want to live because it has that 2-bedroom, that 3-bedroom that I've been looking for? You don't really get that information. So not only is this have fair housing risk in it, talking about the type of people that are living there, but it also is just not a good business strategy, as it's not really a good marketing strategy, I should say. It's not really getting people to be interested in your space. Advertising, also, using human models in advertising. Housing providers should focus on using models that represent a diversity of people or groups of people. If your human models only reflect one protected class, it may discourage people from applying or believing that they belong there, that they're allowed to live there. If you are going to use human models, it should be representative of everyone. Non-representative advertisements open a housing provider up to fair housing. Open them up to fair housing risk. So this is just a little chart we created, 0%, no human models used, provides you with the least amount of fair housing risk because you're focusing on the rooms, the units, the people, or sorry, not the people, the features. And then as you kind of go down that list, you kind of increase your risk. If you have, one residents are of one race, but then the staff are of other races, this has select representation. So there's some risk there. And then if you're showing everyone that, lives and works in your space as being one race, that also can open you up to some risk. We understand that marketing has always been told to, we are attracted to smiles and faces. So we understand that that is a strategy. However, we want you to also be thinking about it from the fair housing standpoint of, is this creating the message that you want? Is this appealing to everyone? So here are some effective advertisements. Affirmative fair housing marketing. Many federal or state funded, insured, or assisted programs in Michigan, again, this is in Michigan, have an obligation to create an affirmatively fair housing marketing plan. This plan, MISHDA requires this specifically for all finance developments maintained, have to maintain that plan on site. This marketing strategy is designed to attract buyers and renters of all majority and minority groups, regardless of a protected class. So again, it's just making sure that everyone is being advertised to or marketed towards. Within these plans, it should be targeting and identifying populations least eligible to apply. There should be some outreach measures to attract different groups, how that would be measured, how you know you'll be successful, what is the staff training on fair housing laws, and then these plans also need to be reviewed every 5 years or when the community development jurisdiction's consolidated plan is updated, or if there's been significant changes in demographics of the project or the local housing market. So when Lindsay had the poll question, if you received federal federal funding, this is kind of knowing if you have an affirmative fair housing marketing plan. If you are a MISHDA funded property, then this is something that you need to be aware of. You maybe need to be looking at, updating. So it's just something to be aware of. Some common mistakes that we have seen is having incomplete information on the within the plan, having insufficient research, failure to advertise in places used by people who have been deemed least likely to apply, lack of follow-up, no standard to ensure the marketing plan was effective, and then lack of current staff training on fair housing laws. When it comes to discounts and perks, is it okay? Discounts and perks must be made available regardless of protected class. So there shouldn't be a specific discount or perk connected to a protected class. Discrimination under fair housing laws includes those terms and privileges and conditions. So an example would be charging a higher cost to an African-American couple over a white couple, or charging families with children higher costs. That can be some things that come out of, having discounts. So just need to evaluate those with that lens of, is one group, being offered this where other groups aren't. Be mindful that advertising under fair housing includes those promotional materials, but also verbal statements. Anything that can be considered advertising is, your words and what is out there in the world promoting your property. So make sure all staff, residents, and applicants are equally aware of all the criteria, the policies, rebates, specials. Consistency is key to compliance. So as consistent as you are with your messaging, the information you're providing, the closer you are to ensuring that you are being compliant and there's no fair housing risk there. Some other best practices: review all your advertising material for implications before publishing or posting. Again, describe the property, not the people. Describe the property, not the people. Do not write anything that says ideal for, as that may open you up to some fair housing risk. When in doubt, take it out and ensure that you are using the Equal Housing Opportunity logo. And we are happy if you are in our service area, you are welcome to reach out to us to review any advertising materials, and we are happy to do so. They do have to be finalized for review. So now we're going to move into screening. Some best practices for screening. We'll go through each of them, but establish relevant fair housing criteria, use recent accurate records, follow your screening policy, be transparent with applicants, and allow applicants to challenge negative information. So when you're establishing that relevant fair housing criteria, excuse me, develop, document, and use clearly defined requirements. An example with this would be minimum household income from all legal ongoing sources, focus on information tied to of compliance with the tenancy. Prioritize use of recent records, review criteria and document regularly, and cross-reference your criteria with your list of protected classes. Would anybody be treated differently based on your criteria? And then don't forget to also make sure that you're looking at your local protections as well. When you're making sure you're using recent, accurate records. It's important to understand that tenant screening data can be incomplete, outdated, and incorrect. And so we have seen instances where people with the same name or similar names are being attributed to the wrong person. So make sure that your records are matching multiple pieces of information. We understand that, relying on screening data can make your job easier. The use of technology can make your job easier, but it's also important to make sure you're verifying the responses that technology is giving you, that it is, following things correctly and that you're doing that double checking. Don't use records with a positive outcome. If not clear, disregard unless you can get additional information. So an example of this would be if there was an eviction on a tenant for a tenant, but they prevailed. They were able to move forward, and it really wasn't an eviction in the end. Think that has a positive outcome. So you wouldn't really utilize that when you're looking at an applicant. So really thinking about and questioning, where is this data coming from? Is there any data cleanup that is being undertaken? How and how often? Because the responsibility and falls still on you as the housing provider. Make sure you're following your screening criteria or your screening policy. Do not request any information that falls outside of your policy. Don't consider records outside of the scope of your stated criminal background policy. If your policy is only screening for felony convictions, don't be looking at misdemeanors. So just make sure you're being consistent again. When you're being transparent with applicants, it's important to let people know how they'll be screened. So have your policies written and publicly available. Transparency also allows people to know that, whether they should apply or, if they should pay the application fee. Applicants should be provided with information on how to submit mitigating circumstances, how to submit reasonable accommodation requests, and how to contest an inaccurate, incomplete, or irrelevant record. So that is part of being the transparent part, is how do you provide further information to maybe that would help with the decision for the applicant. If denied, allow applicants to challenge the negative information. So have an appeal process, make sure that people are aware of that process. Because again, as I stated in the first part of this, is that folks, the records that you may be getting back are actually inaccurate. So if a person is telling you, I actually don't have a criminal background, but your information is saying they do, there should be a way for them to dispute it and provide, substantial information to say that that isn't them. Provide the applicant with information used in the review as a way to understand why they're denied, so folks can understand, if there's something that they need to do to maybe make their record better. Applicants should also have a chance to show, even if the record is accurate, that they will still comply with tenancy obligations. So say maybe they've attended a rehabilitation or financial literacy program, or they've had a change in their education or employment status. Maybe the circumstances that, that were present in the past are no longer present. So allowing applicants to show that. Some other factors to be looking at: credit history. Credit scores are a means to assess creditworthiness. They don't really capture timely rent, utilities, other bill payments, nor payday or non-traditional lender payments. So be looking at how you're looking at credit score. Housing providers should allow for explanation and obviously requests for reasonable accommodations due to disability, which we will cover reasonable accommodations. I know we've used that word a couple of times now, but a reasonable accommodation is a change to a policy. Some questions to consider. What information are you trying to get at when you're checking an applicant's credit history? If your question is really, are they going to pay? Maybe there's another way to get this information, income verification, that may be a way. So be thinking about what are some other ways to get this information if it's not really relevant to maybe the question or what you're trying to get at isn't really relevant. There are no known studies on the relationship between credit scores and successful tenancy, so that's just something to be aware of. Having no or limited credit history is even less relevant than having poor credit. So if a person is just not understanding of the credit system, as I think some folks now, as an adult, I still have some questions about our credit system. So, that is just a area of education that is limited for folks. So maybe folks aren't understanding that they should get a credit card. So just be thinking about those things. Admitting applicants, so as long as they don't have a negative credit history, can be more precise than requiring a positive credit history. Automated screening tools can be programmed to rely on other financial information as a substitute for absent credit score. Then looking at eviction history, it's the most common marketed screening component. It's pulled from private databases from court records. And according to the Urban Institute, there's no national requirement for courts to clean, maintain, or share data in a specific way. So because of this, there's a lot of variability and inaccuracies in these court records. So that's just something to be aware of as you're pulling this data. Is there is no requirement for it to be cleaned, maintained, or shared. So allowing, again, people to provide maybe some substantial information or mitigating for information could be really important. Housing providers should not rely on eviction records that are old, incomplete, irrelevant, or where a better measure of an applicant's behavior is available. Distinguish between the types of evictions and varied outcomes. Eviction proceedings where a tenant prevailed or a settlement was reached or it was dropped should not be considered. Neither should no-fault evictions, so if the property was removed from the market. Again, just reviewing the information that you're getting back from your, the companies you're using, and just when you're looking at an applicant, just be considering some of these things. And then again, having the chance to have it disregarded or corrections made. And then a note here, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, tenant screening companies must include existing disposition information for eviction records. So some questions to consider. What do you need to know about the eviction to determine if the applicant would be a good tenant? Why, when, what were the circumstances? What if it was so long ago that the circumstances no longer apply? So just some things to be, again, thinking about. Now we'll be looking at criminal records. So using criminal history to inconsistently screen, deny, lease renewal, evict, or otherwise exclude individuals from housing for different protected classes may be illegal under fair housing, and ensure reasonable accommodations are required, such as making exceptions to admission policies or disregarding certain criminal records. So a person's disability might make it unlikely that they would reoffend. That could be something to be looking at, or a reasonable accommodation that may come in. Past criminal activity related to a mental health disability that has since been treated. So if this person's criminal history was based on an untreated mental health disability, and now they are in treatment and they have doctors and they have therapists and they have all these folks, groups that are saying this person, is better, and those circumstances are no longer present and they would be a good tenant. That is something to consider or that is something that could be put forward for a reasonable accommodation request. Example of possible discrimination: a landlord states a no felonies policy to a Black applicant, but waives it for a white applicant. Again, that difference in treatment and difference in terms based on a protected class. A landlord tells a Black applicant with an arrest record that the apartment is already rented, but shows it available to a white applicant with an arrest record. So again, these are two applicants, both with arrest records. The only difference is the protected class race, and they are getting different information. So that is possible housing discrimination. Criminal has some best practices when it comes to procedures when you're looking at criminal history. Make sure you're checking for state, local laws or program requirements, regulations, or restrictions that may, limit your ability to run background checks or have different information to be checking for. Consider not using criminal history to screen tenants. Avoid third-party screening companies that use biased algorithms. That has been shown, we've seen that some of these algorithms have not been in favor of certain groups, so just be thinking about that. Delay considering criminal history until after verifying financial or other qualifications. Treat comparable criminal histories similarly. Before denying an applicant or evicting a resident, provide them the criminal record and give them the opportunity to correct the wrong information. And then only evict for criminal activity as a last resort and after an individualized assessment has been done. So when you're looking at an individualized assessment, make sure you're considering the nature, severity, and the recency of the criminal conduct. Accurately distinguish between if it's a risk to resident safety and the property. Crimes such as homicide, sexual assault, arson are very different than crimes that are gambling or tax crimes or prostitution or cyber crimes. Those are very different levels of criminal behavior, and they have different risk to your property and to the people on your property. So that's something you need to be thinking about when you're creating your policies. Avoid automatic denials, blanket bans, such as no felonies, and the consideration of arrests. Provide, again, that individualized assessment if there's any relevant mitigating information. If you are a PHA, this information is relevant for you. So if you're a PHA or a project owner, you must deny admission to anyone within the last 3 years has been evicted from federal housing for drug-related criminal activity, unless there's been drug rehabilitation or circumstances leading to eviction no longer exist. 2, current users of illegal drugs, abusers of alcohol, or pattern interfering with health, safety, and peaceful enjoyment. Anyone who has been convicted of manufacturing methamphetamine on federally assisted property. Anyone subject to a lifetime sex offender list, or anyone with a history of alcohol abuse that a responsible entity believes is a threat to the enjoyment of the property. So these are for PHAs and project owners specifically. The low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC, there is a regarding criminal history, there is a compliance manual that has some information for you to review. So if you are a LIHTC property, this information is relevant to you, and you can check out the pages 4 to 18 and 419 that outline the screening criteria. It essentially says owners must establish a written screening criteria to prohibit drug-related criminal behavior, a state life sex offender registration program, or individuals who abuse or pattern of abuse of alcohol interferes with the health, safety, and peaceful enjoyment of other residents. Okay, that was a lot of information. And so we will now take a break for about 10 minutes. So I will see everyone back here at 10:29. This is just a verbal warning. We got a minute. So if you're chatting, getting some coffee, we'll be starting in just a minute here. Alrighty, we will now be starting with the second half of our training this morning. So head back to your desk if you are not at it already. And we'll be moving into race, color, and national origin. I actually am gonna check with the Q&A first before I actually get started. So I see we have a couple in here. So the first one we have, so a person with tattoos can be discriminated against. There are no protections that in our area that I'm aware of. It depends on if those protections exist in any of the localities that you work in. I think I've heard that California might have some protections with tattoos. So it depends on where you are, but there's no federal protections, state protections, or any local protections that I'm aware of for people with tattoos. Is there a way that specifics regarding occupancy can be indicated without being putting at risks, i.e. 55 years older, student housing, etc.? Yes, we will be talking, I think I'll be talking about that. But if you are a 55 and year older property, you can advertise that way. If you are doing the age checks and you have that in place. And then for student, you again have to be ensuring that you're doing, you have a check in place, essentially. Are you verifying that they're enrolled at a local institution? And then that also cannot have any other protected classes barriers. So, if it's a non-traditional age student, that can't prohibit somebody from living there if they are a student and you're considered student housing. So it depends. You can always reach out to us if you have a specific advertising question or content that you'd like us to review that you're worried about putting you at risk. So it depends. And again, with the student housing, make sure you're looking at your local protections because I believe Ann Arbor has student protections. I am a new board member on a condo association board. I have a question about assistance animals. We allow owners to have their service animals and wonder about guests or wonder if we are allowed to have short-time visitors bring service animal dogs to our condo prohibits dogs. Thank you. Oh, emotional support dog. Our understanding, we've gotten this information from the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. Our understanding is that guests should be allowed to have, should be able to bring their assistance animals. However, we really just have only heard that. There's nothing that we can really point to. So you're welcome to call MDCR and get that information if you would like, or an attorney. Okay, so that was all the questions for now. Please remember to put any questions in the Q&A, and any questions in the chat may be missed. I also just want to Just to do a quick couple reminders, attendance verification will be done via a survey link that we will provide at the end. Everybody individually must complete it if they are attending today, so please make sure folks complete that at the end. Okay, and then we can move forward. Race, color, and national origin. Race refers to people distinguished by socially significant perceived physical traits, including hair texture, skin color, eye shape, and other differences. Color refers to a person's skin color. So if somebody's light or darker skin color for their skin based on their race, they are also protected. National origin refers to one's country of origin or where an individual's birth or when ancestors originated from. So this can be ethnicity, ancestry, culture, spoken language, appearance associated with a specific nationality, and more. Additionally, the perception of somebody's race, color, and or national origin is also protected under the law. Some examples of this, we have some on the next slide, but a case example that we have is an individual where we've seen it where individuals have been given different waiting list time. So there was an individual, was a gentleman. He was applying to a senior complex, and he was a Black gentleman. He had been from California, and he was applying at a senior complex that was near his hospital. And he was very friendly with the lending or the leasing agent. One day he came home, and he saw his neighbor was moving, and he was like, "Oh, where are you moving from?" And she was like, "ABC Apartments." And he was like, "No way, I've been on the wait list forever." And he was like, "How long have you been waiting?" And she was like, 2 months. Well, he had unfortunately been on the waiting list for 7 years. So they were managing two different wait lists. So that was, and it was based on race. So that is an example where there is race discrimination. And unfortunately, that gentleman did pass away. His family's estate is pursuing that case, and I don't have any updates on that. But that is something, just to be aware of that can be happening. And don't do it. Examples of possible other examples of possible discrimination: a landlord renting to a light-skinned African American, but not those who are darker skinned. So that is a discrimination based on color. Neighbors or housing providers harassing tenants, such as using racial slurs or making offensive and threatening statements. Steering darker-skinned applicants to units at the back of the apartment complex, again, based on color. Misrepresenting the availability of an apartment because the applicant is Asian American. Again, that difference of treatment based on race. Treating a resident differently because of their race of their guests. So that's important to be also knowing. A landlord states a no felonies policy to a Black applicant, but waives it for a white applicant, which we talked about in the screening. Now moving into sex and gender. Sex and gender protections, there really should be no preference on the basis of sex. So, and then gender preference language can only be used in advertising for roommates or for people who are having shared living areas. So gender preference language can only be used in those two situations. If there's a shared living kind of arrangement, that's kind of an old law understanding. But oftentimes that isn't often what people are looking for roommates anymore. It's really, can you pay the rent and are you clean? But that is an exception that is made for gender protections. Examples of possible discrimination for sex and gender: refusing to rent to female tenants because the lease includes taking care of the yard and snow removal. So again, thinking that female tenants may not take care of those things, whereas male tenants would, that has some fair housing risk there. In some instances, treating someone differently because they are a survivor of domestic violence. Sexual harassment by a housing provider or administrator it would be sex discrimination. A housing provider evicting a female victim of domestic violence, but not the male perpetrator. Disability status. So this one is a little bit longer of a section. So we will briefly talk about assistance animals. So if you have any questions, please wait till the end because we may answer them, but you are welcome to put them in the Q&A. So disability status is broadly defined. It covers both mental and physical disabilities. It is defined under the Fair Housing Act as being a physical or mental impairment that limits a major life activity, which we'll talk about major life activities in a second. A record of having such an impairment, and then being regarded as having such an impairment. So with any of the protected classes, if you're treated differently based on that protected class, and you're presumed to have, that characteristic and treated differently, that is having risk. So what I'm saying is, for disability, if you don't have a disability, but you're denying someone because you think they have a disability or think that they, have, they're of a different race or things like that, then that is protected. You can't regard somebody as having such an impairment or being of a different race or things like that and treat them differently. That is still covered. Major life activity is also broadly defined and includes physical, mental, and social activities and working. So sleeping, walking, eating, driving, hearing, seeing, those would be considered major life activities. It is permissible to specify no smoking or other similar behavior, but it is not permissible to discriminate against people with a health condition or physical problem. So clearly state that the unacceptable behavior, so the behavior is no drinking, rather than the type of person, no drinkers. Again, don't be describing people. That is really where the fair housing risk lies, is describing people. Alcoholism and drug addictions can be disabilities under fair housing law, but current drinking or drug use is not protected. So that is something to be aware of. Some examples: a leasing agent refuses to show units to someone using a wheelchair, saying it wouldn't be a good fit. Deny, even though I want to state with that one, some of these things, when it comes to disability discrimination, oftentimes we see that the intent of the housing provider was supposed to be good, but you're removing housing choice. So even if your intent is good and you're not providing all the information that a person is requesting, but you don't think it would benefit them, that is still removing that housing choice and puts you at fair housing risk. So even though the home may not have a wheelchair ramp or an accessible entrance, not showing it to them would remove that, that ability for them to live there, because there are things like reasonable accommodations and modifications, which we'll talk about, for that person to live there. So that is something to keep in mind. We often also see that with familial status discrimination as well. There's well-intention behind it, but it's removing housing choice and not giving everyone the information, all the information. That consistency. Denial of a request for a service or assistance animal because of a no pets policy. Refusal to permit reasonable modifications such as a wheelchair ramp or grab bars. And asking applicants for a medical history to prove that they can have a disability or to prove that they can live independently. We have had some senior housing trainings in the past, but if it's an independent living facility, you can't ask applicants to prove that they can live independently. Independent living for seniors is just housing. There's no services attached. So there is possible discrimination there if you are asking that. Reasonable accommodation. So what is this? I've mentioned it a few times. It's a change in rule, policy, procedure, or service that is needed for a person with a disability to have equal access and enjoyment of their housing. So an example of this would be waiving a no pet policy for a person with a disability having an assistance animal, or assigning a designated accessible parking space because a person with a disability does not have maybe ease of access or ease of ability to walk there. They maybe have a heart condition that doesn't allow them to walk long distances. So they may need a designated accessible parking space. I will say that this is different than those blue marked lines that are by your leasing office. Those are different sets of parking spaces under the ADA or Americans with Disabilities Act, and those are different than fair housing laws. So those ones are for public spaces. An assigned designated accessible parking space is something a person with a disability can request as an accommodation. So just those are two different. We often get questions about that. So I just wanted to clear that up now. Generally, accommodations are the responsibility of the housing provider as they are your rules, your policies. So they're your responsibility to help modify for them to be able to live there, to have that equal access. There is a joint statement here from the DOJ on reasonable accommodations. It's kind of a Q&A type document. So feel free to look at that. You can use the control find feature to maybe look up some keywords that maybe you have questions on. That is a really good resource to use. Processing reasonable accommodations, be thinking about the existing policy or rule. What does that say? What is your standard procedure? How is this request different? Is there documentation needed? It depends. Do they have a visible disability? We'll talk about that. When or how does the policy service get changed? This all requires some homework, some looking into. Maybe it requires you communicating back and forth with the person with a disability, hearing and listening to what they need. But it does require some more steps, but that is something we can also help you with, walk you through. And we also did provide a guidebook in the handouts. And if you did not get those handouts via email, Liz has posted the link in the chat a few times, so you can check those out there. But there is a guidebook that you can also look at to process RAs that we have. Reasonable modifications are structural or physical changes to a unit or housing structure for a person with a disability to have that physical access. So most common one we think of is a ramp to a building's entrance, but grab bars are also, or changing the type of doorknob instead of a knob to a handle or lever. Reasonable modifications must be allowed when reasonable for the most part, especially if you receive federal financial assistance. These structural changes needed are considered reasonable accommodations, and they must be paid for by the housing provider unless they are unreasonable or the person's needs can be met through other means. So just be thinking about that. So if you, for reasonable modifications, they must be allowed. If you receive federal financial assistance, you must pay for those. And then if you don't, then oftentimes it does fall onto the tenant, but there are some situations where it may not, but you're welcome to reach out to us for those if you have, more specific instances. Again, the DOJ has a joint statement on this as well, and it's very similar to the accommodation one. Again, kind of Q&A, gives examples, really great resource. Some steps when processing modifications, be thinking about who's going to use it. Is it just for the sole use of the individual requesting it, or is it going to be in a common space? Will there be any issues regarding code compliance? Is there any documentation that you need? Do you need plans or drawings? Thinking about who pays for it. Again, going back to that question Lindsay asked in the beginning, how is your property funded? That is why it's crucial, and it's why we ask that, because that then changes what laws apply. It might be the Fair Housing Act, it might be Section 504, it may be the American Disabilities Act. It all depends. So just knowing when laws apply, how your property is funded is important to figuring out these things. Again, private housing, generally the tenant pays, and if it's federally funded housing, generally the housing provider pays. Those are kind of general rules, but again, may require some homework and research. And then also thinking about what happens when the tenant moves out. Is it something that you're just going to keep? Then maybe it doesn't make sense for the tenant to pay for it because you're going to continue to use it going forward. So thinking about these things, again, homework, and that's something we also can help with. And again, we have that guidebook, and we also provided a sample response form that is in the guidebook, but also we provided it separately as one of the handouts. So for accommodations and modifications, tenants can request them at any time during their lease. It doesn't have to be at the beginning of the lease or within the first 30 days. Our abilities change as time changes. So folks may need different things at different times. Additionally, tenants with unobservable disabilities or disability-based needs can be asked to provide documentation on why the changes are needed. It just, again, is if it's unobservable, if you do not see the disability or disability-related need, then that's when you can ask for documentation. But if you see somebody, an obvious one would be if you see somebody in a wheelchair and they ask for a ramp, that wouldn't require on documentation because you can see and you understand why they have you see their disability and understand their disability related need. Tenants can request more than one accommodation or modification. Again, it's based on their needs. A request must not create an unreasonable burden on the housing provider, such as not getting paid rent, as an example. So again, these requests do have to be reasonable, and we understand that. But it is something, again, we can help with, so feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. Here is a good example of an access aisle. There is clearly marked signs. There's a good slope to the pavement. So this is a good example of some good disability handicap spaces. This is a bad example of a modification where they just stuck a handicap sign onto some stairs where that clearly is not accessible. This was, I believe, also submitted into court documents as they were trying to say, yeah, we did do it. I believe the judge was not happy about that. So not a good example, just putting something up. Now moving into assistance animals. People with disabilities may request reasonable accommodations for assistance animals in addition to dogs, including emotional support animals. In situations where both the Fair Housing Act or Section 504 apply, housing providers must meet the broader standard in deciding whether to grant reasonable accommodation requests. Species other than dogs, with or without training, and animals that provide emotional support have been recognized as necessary under the accommodation provisions of the Fair Housing Act and Section 504. Under the Fair Housing Act and Section 504, individuals with a disability may be entitled to keep an assistance animal as a reasonable accommodation. In order to qualify for such an accommodation, they must be necessary to afford the individual an equal opportunity to enjoy and participate in the housing service or program. Again, there also must be a relationship or a nexus between the disability and the disability-related need, or the disability and the assistance the animal provides. So that does have to be provided. If it's unobservable, that is something that you can ask for. You can ask for documentation. If these requirements are met, a housing facility, program, or service must permit it, unless it can demonstrate that allowing the assistance animal would impose an undue financial or administrative burden. So, the person must show that they are a person with a disability and they have a disability-related need. These requests may also be denied if the animal poses a direct threat to the health, safety, and others, and if it cannot be reduced or eliminated, by any other reasonable ways, if the specific animal would cause substantial physical damage to the property of others that cannot be reduced or eliminated. So if there is a direct threat there, if they cannot control the animal, that may be a reason to deny it. However, you do have to work with the person to see if they can be reduced or eliminated. If it is a dog that it does bite, maybe just it needs a muzzle while it's out in the public area. That would be, that reduces that direct threat. Some best practices here. Assistance animals, including service dogs and emotional support animals, are allowed. Any animal can be requested. However, unique animals, maybe like a monkey, might require more documentation to say this specific animal does this specific thing for my disability. So if it is a unique animal, that may require more documentation. There is no limit on how many assistance animals a person can have. However, they do need to substantiate the need for those multiple animals. Dog A does this, dog B does this. The owners of an assistance animal must ensure that their assistance animal is under control and cleaned up after, or they have to make arrangements to do so. So somebody else can help them. A caretaker, a family member can help them clean up after the animal and take care of their animal. Some more best practices. Housing providers cannot require training or specific certificates for assistance animals, cannot require the use of specific forms to request an assistance animal. These things have been shown by case law. Housing providers cannot apply pet policies to assistance animals, including charging pet fees. It's very clear that charging people with disabilities fees for any accommodations opens you up to fair housing risk. Placing restrictions on the breed, size, or weight of the assistance animal is also something that cannot be done. When looking at supporting documentation, a housing provider is entitled to have information necessary to evaluate whether or not that modification or accommodation is necessary because of a disability, but only when, again, the disability is not obvious or known and the disability-related need is not readily apparent or otherwise known to you. So if somebody is coming to you and they say, I have this reasonable accommodation request, and you immediately ask for for documentation, but you already know that they receive, disability income, or they've already told you, or they already have another accommodation in for a different disability. So it's always important to just pause and think about, what do you already know? What information do you already have before immediately asking for that supporting documentation? If the disability is not obvious, what kinds of information may a housing provider request? So what do you still need to know? Generally, is this person a disability defined by law? And what is the disability related need? And what is the nexus between them? What is the connection between the disability and the disability related need? Again, that's if it's not obvious. Approval or denial of requests depends on the circumstances presented and needs to be determined on a case-by-case basis. So make sure you have all the information that you need. Again, you may have to work with the individual. Typically, people with disabilities are the best advocates for an understanding of what they know about their limitations posed by their disability. So they have the most knowledge about what they need. So it's really best to listen to them. But obviously, we'll talk about reasonableness, but there is, reasonable things. But again, it's your responsibility as a housing provider to work with them. They do have to work with you too. It still has to be, a mutual relationship where you're working together on what works and what can be done. But make sure you're documenting every step taken, with anything, not just with accommodations and modifications. Make sure you document everything that you're doing that's been said or done, as that is best, to have that information if there is ever a case that comes against you. It is also important to keep all information confidential. For reasonableness, thinking about, is there an undue financial or administrative burden? Would this accommodation fundamentally alter the nature of the housing provider's operations? Is this person asking you to take them to and from their doctor's appointments and the grocery store because they can't drive because of their disability? Well, you don't offer those services, and it would require you to add much more, there'd be a financial burden there as you'd have to, buy a vehicle, you would have to hire staff, things like that. It's outside of your operation, so that would be unreasonable. If the original request is found to be unreasonable, though, what are some alternatives? And these must be provided. So if you cannot meet an individual's request, what are alternatives that then you can provide? If you cannot, provide a ramp or something to their second floor unit, is it that they need to move units. Maybe that's the alternative. Thinking creatively on what would work for an individual, and also just asking them as well. Like provide some alternatives, but also listen to them on what may work if the initial thing does not work. Alrighty, now I am going to turn it over to Lindsay, who will be talking about familial and marital status.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
I should
think,
check really quick if we have questions before we.
yeah, I was gonna say before we turn it over, I think we have quite a few questions. Um, the first one, these are all disability related. If a person has an approved service animal, in parentheses dog, and your policy requests a leash, but said person refuses to follow the rule because of a pet illness as a landlord, what can you do under the Fair Housing Act?
Yeah, that's a really great question. If the rule is to have a leash, really my understanding is the only way they would be exempt from that rule is if there was a disability related need for not having a leash. So that would be the only exemption and additional accommodation that can be provided. Otherwise, you would follow your lease. Whatever your lease parameters are, with not following, rules and policies.
There's another question. Would this include lowering countertops for someone in a wheelchair? I think this is related to reasonable modifications.
Yeah, that can be a reasonable modification if somebody is requesting lowering countertops, counters. That can be a reasonable modification. Again, you would have to go through those steps that I listed. Is that make sure if you have to look at your building codes and your layouts and things like that, you have to still go through that list of like what can be done, but that is something a person can request if there's a disability related need. If they can't reach above their counter, I could see why they would request that.
Absolutely. Are there any low-cost things we can do to proactively make our property more accessible and inclusive?
Oh, that is a really great question. I am not familiar with any, but you could probably reach out to any of your um, disability advocates or disability networks in your communities. They may have some ideas on how to make your property more accessible and inclusive. I know the disability, if you're in Kent County on the west side of Michigan, Disability Advocates of Kent County does a lot of things to ensure properties are accessible. So I'm sure they would love to work with housing providers to do so. And they're a nonprofit, so they would understand, trying to make things low cost as well. Great question. And if anyone has any, suggestions, feel free to put them in the chat or connect with the individual who asked the question, which I lost they went to the next page. Sorry.
Yeah. Um, Someone asked, can we require a pet to be vaccinated? I think they're probably meaning an assistance animal to be vaccinated because assistance animals are not pets.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for making that clarification. And I should have made that more clear in my section. But yes, assistance animals are not pets. So it's important to also not, when you're talking about them, talk about them as pets because they are subject to different rules and policies. However, my understanding is for assistance animals can be requested to be vaccinated if it's based on local or state rules and things like that. So I know, and for example, I know in Kent County, pets, dogs specifically need to be vaccinated for rabies. So that is something that is required by, the local county. So you can hold people accountable to that.
The next question we have, we keep getting a lot of questions in, so let me know when you think we should stop and answer them at the end. But we have a resident who wants a reasonable accommodation for not paying late fees because of their disability. When we already offer auto payments, would this be considered a reasonable accommodation?
That's a good question. I think we would need a little bit more detail on that, because there is an instance where I'm thinking it could be. So say a reasonable accommodation to the payment, the rental due date. So if they're a person with a disability and they receive disability income and it's coming on the 6th of the month, but after the 4th of the month, they start accumulating late fees. That would be some things that somebody could request a reasonable accommodation for, is to change their rental due date to when their disability income comes. So if it comes on the 6th, then their rent could be changed to be accepted on the 6th. And then whatever your grace period is, 4 days, then after the 10th, they would start accumulating late fees. So that would be an example where that could be a reasonable accommodation. But for your instance, we would need a little bit more detail. So feel free to reach out to us. And we'll just take one more, I think, and then we'll let Lindsay start familial status and marital status information.
Yeah, and just to go back to the disclaimers at the beginning, we don't have attorneys on staff, so any of the answers that we're providing is not legal advice. So if you have legal questions, you need to consult a lawyer. And then also just like for some of these questions, being willing to work with people with disabilities is also important. So when you're asking about prohibiting, just keep that in mind, that it's important to work with a person with a disability to figure out something that can help them and assist them. So the final question we'll answer in this moment is, if a resident that utilizes an electric motorized device fails to show the capability to operate, can we prohibit their use of?
Oh, that is a good question as well. Again, I think we would need a little bit more information on what you mean by the capability to operate. And there may not be it may not be something we could answer to, depending on the scenario surrounding it. If they're a danger to other people and they're running people over, that's a harm to your residents. So that would be, a conversation with them to say, we need, something needs to change here. So you may have to work with the individual. You can't just immediately tell them you can't use it. So that's probably the key there, is working with the individual, again, as Lindsay said, to not so they would not have their accommodation or modification, because people with disabilities need those, and refusing them or prohibiting them opens you up for fair housing risk.
Yeah, and we want to make sure that people with disabilities have equal access and enjoyment of the places where they're living. And so keeping that in mind, that working with the person to try and figure out how they can have equal access and enjoyment is important. So just keep that perspective in mind when you're thinking about questions that you have. Okay. We will answer more questions later on, but now I'm going to get into protections for familial and marital status. So it is unlawful to discriminate against anyone because of their familial status. Familial status refers to whether or not an individual has minor children under the age of 18 living with them in the home. Familial status includes single individuals, people who are pregnant, people in the process of adopting or securing legal custody, and foster children. Some examples of possible discrimination based on familial status include having a policy that residents cannot have more than 2 children in the household, a refusal to rent or sell to a family because of the presence of children under the age of 18, or pregnancy, denying families or children access to recreational facilities, imposing unreasonable rules because children are present or imposing rules specifically on children, charging an extra fee per child or higher rent or deposit because of the presence of a child, imposing different standards based on children's ages, restricting families with children to certain floors or areas of a complex, and then housing advertisements that say no kids or adults only. Those are examples of possible discrimination based on familial status. Marital status protects people from discrimination based on whether or not they are married. This is a protected class in the state of Michigan. not a federally protected class. Marital status includes single people, people who are divorced, married couples, and those who are separated. A person's marital status cannot be used to discriminate against them. I think I saw a question earlier in the Q&A asking about whether a housing provider can require couples to be married, and under marital status protections, housing providers cannot do that because single people, people who aren't married, married couples, they're all protected under marital status protections. Some examples of possible discrimination based on marital status include charging more rent for couples who are not married, requiring a higher rent or down payment for a single woman, not letting people add a partner to their lease because they're not married, requiring a couple to be married before moving in together, and suggesting people move based on a change in their marital status. Something to think about when it comes to familial and marital status protections is occupancy limits. Housing providers must comply with all applicable local laws, regulations, and financing requirements when it comes to occupancy. Housing providers should also be aware of applicable occupancy standards for their properties. Some occupancy regulations can change based on the municipality a property is located in. So it's really important that housing providers do the work to figure out what occupancy limits and local restrictions apply to them. Below are some resources that you can utilize to kind of determine occupancy standards based on your property. It's really important that occupancy limits are not more restrictive than the applicable laws or requirements. Although a housing provider may reasonably limit occupancy based on local health and safety codes, it's important to keep these limits out of advertising. Having them in advertising is an invitation for a discrimination claim. It carries some risk to it. Occupancy limits are a technical determination, and it's difficult to verify that an occupancy limit is reasonable and therefore legal. So it's really similar to some of the earlier information on advertising. It's really best to talk about the property rather than the people. So just talk about the property size. It's a 2-bedroom apartment, 3-bedroom apartment, stuff like that. Offering different rates based on the number of people to occupy housing may also violate fair housing laws. Other violations include indicating people without kids get a preferential price, penalties for getting married, things like that. So just be aware of these potential violations when you're making your policies and your practices. Now we will discuss a bit more about protections for religion. Discrimination in housing because of religion is prohibited under local, state, and federal fair housing laws. These religious protections protect against discrimination, whether someone is a member of a particular religion or if they're not a member of a particular religion at all. The Fair Housing Act provides a narrow exemption for religious organizations to limit the sale, rental, or occupancy of housing to members of their own religion, as long as the housing is not operated for commercial purposes. So an example of this exemption might be Catholic nuns in a convent that's not being operated for a commercial purpose, but members of a religious group are living in that housing. Advertising for such housing should include a disclaimer statement such as this home does not discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status. And then as long as symbols and terms relating to religious holidays are secularized, they will not automatically constitute a violation of fair housing laws. Some examples are Merry Christmas or Santa Claus. Statements using the legal name of an establishment that contain a religious reference or religious symbol may not violate the law unless it includes, or may violate the law unless it includes a disclaimer stating they do not discriminate on the basis of any protected classes. Housing providers are allowed to describe services or facilities that are available for particular housing units, such as an apartment complex that has a chapel or a senior housing development with kosher meals that are available. Some examples of possible discrimination based on religion include prohibiting use of community spaces within a complex for religious purposes if those areas are permitted to be used for secular gatherings. Some other examples of possible discrimination based on religion include asking about an applicant's religion, ignoring or not following up with an applicant because of their religion, advertising that a home is located near a particular place of worship, allowing religious decorations for certain religions, but not for others, making negative comments about a person's religion, or harassing tenants who wear religious accessories, head coverings, or garments, creating or tolerating graffiti or vandalism representing religion-based hatred, and then running ads in only one religious publication. So those are some examples of things that carry fair housing risk. Now we'll talk a bit more about age protections. Age is a protection in the state of Michigan. Age is prohibited under state and local fair housing laws. Age refers to biological age. As long as a person can legally enter into a contract, they're over 18 or they're emancipated, age cannot be used as a basis to discriminate in housing in Michigan. There is an exemption for senior housing from age and familial status protections. In the state of Michigan, a minor, a person under the age of 18 years of age is emancipated automatically in the following circumstances: when a minor is legally married, when a minor reaches the age of 18 years, when on active duty in the armed forces of the United States, and then for the purposes of consenting to medical care, a child is considered emancipated when in the custody of law enforcement if the parents cannot be located. Examples of possible age discrimination include condo associations limiting occupants or buyers based on age, apartment complexes steering certain age groups to certain areas or buildings, such as an under 14 building, refusing to rent to someone because they are over or under a certain age, such as no one under 40 years old, advertising statements like dynamic community for young adults that indicate a preference for younger people, steering older applicants to less desirable units or buildings in an apartment development, more restrictive income, credit, or rental history requirements for younger or older applicants, and then advertising an adult-only or active senior community. Housing that qualifies as senior housing is exempt from familial status and age protections, like I said a few slides ago, but they must meet some requirements under the Housing for Older Persons Act, or HOPA. If it meets the following: the dwelling is specifically designed for and occupied by elderly persons under federal, state, or local government programs, or it's occupied solely 100% by people 62 and older, or it houses at least one person who is 55 or older in at least 80% of the occupied units, and adheres to a policy that demonstrates an intent to house people who are 55 or older. You can find more information about senior housing in our guide for seniors, caretakers, and housing providers that's linked here. There are limited protections for student status. Check your local fair housing laws to see if student status is a protection. If student status is not protected, it may not violate fair housing laws to give a preference or impose a limit to students, as long as it's applied to all students, not just those of a traditional student age. So some examples are discounts for students or prohibiting students. Now I'll discuss a little bit about sexual orientation and gender identity protections. Sexual orientation and gender identity protections are a statewide protection in Michigan through the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, or ELCRA, but they're also protected in many other local communities, including the city of Grand Rapids and I believe East Grand Rapids. ELCRA provides protections for actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Sexual orientation is a person's enduring physical, romantic, or emotional attraction to another person. Some examples of different sexual orientations are heterosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, asexual, pansexual, and many others. It's about who you're attracted to and want to have relationships with. Under ELCRA, sexual orientation is defined legally as having an orientation for heterosexuality, homosexuality, or bisexuality, or having a history of such an orientation or being identified with such an orientation. So really actual sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation are protected under ELCRA. And then gender identity is a person's internal, deeply held knowledge of their own gender. It's different than sexual orientation. Some examples of gender identity are man, woman, non-binary, and other identities. Under ELCRA, gender identity and expression are defined legally as having or being perceived as having a gender-related self-identity or expression, whether associated with an individual's assigned sex at birth or not. And then gender expression are kind of those external manifestations of gender expressed through a person's name, the pronouns that they use, clothing, haircut, voice, and behavior. So again, like sexual orientation, gender identity and expression are protected as someone's actual gender identity or someone's perceived gender identity is protected under ELCRA. Some examples of possible discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity include the leasing manager stating at a 55 plus community, rejected a male tenant's request to add his same-sex partner to his lease, stating in writing that the community only accepts married couples in unions between one man and one woman. That would be potential discrimination based on sexual orientation. And then a maintenance worker employed by a housing provider subjects a female tenant to pervasive harassment because she is a lesbian. Additional discrimination occurs when the tenant reports the harassment to the housing provider, who fails to take any action to stop the harassment. So those are some potential examples of discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Before I turn it over to Bree, I wanted to check if there's any questions from the past few sections. I think there's a few. Question of minors staying overnight without their parents in a PRAC 202, can this be restricted?
I'm not familiar what that is referencing, so I cannot provide any information on that, but I think Liz is typing an answer to you right now.
There's another question. 2-bedroom apartment, the small second bedroom would make a great office. Is there anything wrong with this advertisement statement?
Thinking about it. Offhand, I don't see anything. Offhand, it doesn't bring any fair housing risk, but I'd have to think about it a little bit more. You're not talking about people, things like that. So I think you're just stating that it's a smaller second room and it would be a good office. But I could see maybe some arguments that there could be some familial status discrimination, but I'm not. And Liz is also typing to you now. So she's going to provide you with some more information as well, and you can find that in the answered tab. And then the last one, we have a 15-year-old emancipated minor due to family separation. that is court ordered, they would be allowed to sign an application and a lease. Yes, if they are officially, they are legally an emancipated minor and they have that documentation, then they, from our understanding, again, we're not lawyers, we cannot provide legal advice, but from our understanding, they should be allowed to sign an application and a lease. But that may be something you also want to check with an attorney because I don't know enough about court law or contract law. So, but from my understanding, they should be able to. Okay, please put your Q&A questions in the Q&A. Again, just a reminder, questions in the chat may be missed or not answered. Okay, thanks, Lindsay. So now I will talk about source of income. This is our new protection in the state of Michigan. So again, this is for the state of Michigan, and this went into effect in April of this year. And we did provide a fact sheet on this as well in the handouts. Again, you can find that in the link that's provided in the chat. So source of income refers to where one's income comes from. We're thinking about the source of the income. So, and housing providers can always consider a tenant's income as they're always consider the amount of the income and their ability to pay rent and other financial obligations. These protections were put into place really to help cost-burdened folks, people that are spending 30% or more on monthly income, and severely cost-burdened folks spending 50% or more income to obtain and maintain housing. These protections prohibit housing providers from specifying or limiting the source of income they accept. So again, we're thinking about where the income is coming from. That cannot be limited. The following include, these are other laws and areas where source of income protections fall. So that is also something to be thinking about. There's more layers to this than just the Michigan's Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act. It's also protected under Michigan's Landlord-Tenant Act now. LIHTC properties have some protections, and there's also local protections in different cities. City of Grand Rapids, Holland, Kentwood, and Wyoming in our service area have these protections. So just be aware that these protections exist, and the exemptions that I'll talk about under Elliott-Larsen may not be the exemptions in those other spaces, so just be aware of that. Excuse me. Again, this went into effect on April 2nd, and it amended both the Elliott-Larsen or ELCRA and the Landlord-Tenant Act. It is defined as including benefits or subsidy programs such as housing or public assistance, housing choice vouchers, veterans benefits, Social Security income, supplemental security income, and other retirement programs. And then there's a broad, catch-all of other programs administered by any federal, state, local, or nonprofit entity. This also may include other types of housing vouchers, child support, alimony, and other income. Specifically for LIHTC properties, all properties that are financed with that low-income housing tax credit are required to accept vouchers as a source of income. So if you are a LIHTC property, you are required to already accept vouchers as a source of income. LIHTC properties are expressly prohibited from discriminating against voucher holders. Owners are required to certify every year that they are adhering to that requirement. State housing agencies are also responsible for monitoring LIHTC property owners for compliance. So there is that other level of protection depending on your funding. So make sure you're aware of that. What are HCVs and VASH vouchers? So if you're not familiar, housing choice vouchers, or an HCV, that is rental assistance that is funded by the federal government and is administered by a local public housing authority, or a PHA. This is to help people with low income pay their rent. So a tenant with a housing choice voucher pays a fixed portion of their rent, and it's based on a certain formula set up. And then the program pays the remainder of that rent directly to the landlord. So the tenant never sees that voucher. It goes directly to the landlord. And the VASH program is another type of housing choice voucher, but this is specifically for veterans who are experiencing homelessness and their families. The program includes case management through the Department of Veteran Affairs. But that's just a little, if you aren't familiar with those things, that's what those are. For Michigan source of income protections, housing providers are allowed to require a certain income amount to rent a unit, but they cannot specify the source of said income. One source of income must be legal and ongoing. It does not include income derived in an illegal manner. Housing agencies tasked with handling vouchers must approve these applications within 30 days. So it is, these protections are these bills, when they were put in place, were considering, housing providers as well, because it would be unreasonable for a housing provider to keep a unit off the market for more than 30 days if the housing agency is not moving quickly with processing that voucher and all the information that's required to approve it. I also wanted to make note because we had this question earlier and somebody was asking, would inconsistent income from a business be considered? I do want to make note, these are new protections again since April of this year. So there's a lot that's going to be learned as there's cases put out and things like that. So there's a lot of things that we may not have answers to currently, but we are trying our best to have understandings and things like that of the law. So please be patient with us when you do have questions because we may just not have the answer yet. But we do have best practices that we'll talk about to make sure that you are staying compliant. Like I said, there was an exemption for this law, but it's only for the one under ELCRA. So Michigan source of income protections do provide exemptions for smaller landlords with fewer than 5 units in the state. This does the Michigan Tenant Landlord Act amended. This does not apply to a person. Oh, sorry, it was under the Michigan Tenant Landlord Act. That is the exemption. So it's fewer than 5 rental units, but it includes all the units within that a person has. So person is defined as an individual, partnership, corporation, association, LLC, or any other legal entity. And then a related entity is really a person that directly or indirectly controls or controlled by that housing. So if a housing provider has multiple LLCs, offers operating multiple entities, have a mix of units that are privately owned, some are under a corporation. These are all related entities and they are not exempt if there are more than 5. So if you have 2 LLCs and one has 3 and one has 6, the one with 3 isn't exempt and the one with 6 isn't exempt. Sorry, did I say that backwards? Yes, that's correct. You would not fall under this exemption because your total portfolio is more than 5. So that's what it's kind of looking at. Additionally, actually, the next slide will go over this. So who is covered? Any landlord with 5 or more housing units. These are landlords of a rental unit or a rental property manager included. These are people who lease or sublease to someone. Anyone that's authorized as an aspect of the management of the unit, and any person who acts as a rental agent or receives rent. So this does include, partnerships, corporations, property managers, rental agents, real estate agents, brokers. If you're a property management company, if the individual, so if you're a property management company and you have an individual owner who is exempt, you are not exempt because you have more than 5 units in your portfolio. That individual may be exempt, but you are not because you are acting as the rental agent. Or you're acting as, the person who receives rent, you're authorizing the, aspect of the management of the unit. So you are not exempt. So you cannot discriminate based on source of income. So what is prohibited? Because of source of income, a housing provider cannot deny or terminate an individual. So refusing to rent to someone because they have Social Security income would be considered prohibited under this protection. Any changes in the price, terms, conditions, privileges, things like that are in connection with the unit. So this would be charging extra fees or higher deposit or higher rent because someone has a housing choice voucher. That would be prohibited under this protection, not maintaining units but occupied by voucher holders to the same standard, not providing equal access to the amenities and facilities based on the tenant's source of income. So if the person's source of income is, alimony, and you're not allowing them to access the pool, that would be prohibited under this protection. Additionally, making a unit unavailable if the tenant is otherwise eligible, or representing the unit as unavailable, or knowingly not including them. So telling an applicant with a VASH voucher that the unit is rented, even though it is still available. Discouraging rentals. So this could be requiring additional references, imposing additional or an unreasonable screening criteria, or ignoring voucher payments when determining if an applicant has enough income to afford the unit. So if you're requiring additional references for people that receive vouchers or have child support, whatever it may be, the other income, that is discouragement. That's considered discouraging. Publishing any ads or making statements about the preference. So having an advertisement that says working people only or no Section 8, that would put you up for fair housing risk. Requiring residents to have a job or work a certain number of hours also could be a violation under this protection. Again, be thinking about your local source of income protections. It is unlawful to discriminate on the basis of a person's legal and verifiable income in Grand Rapids, Holland, Kentwood, and Wyoming. Other local ordinance may include it. So again, it's important to know all of the protections within your property. If you're moving properties around, if you move to different properties, make sure you know that this property has an additional protection and that property may not. Just be aware of that. In general, language referring to a person's occupation, lack of occupation, or receipt of some type of government assistance could trigger liability under these protections. And again, source of income can include many different types of income. Now, looking at best practices, provide equal treatment to all applicants and tenants, regardless of their source of income. Do not treat people differently because of their source of income. Accept and count all income derived from lawful ongoing sources. Do not express any limitations or preferences about income or employment status in ads or communications. Work with an agency that administers the housing voucher. Update your policies and practices as needed to enter into third-party agreements or accept third-party payments. And do not retaliate against applicants or tenants that are seeking to enforce their fair housing rights. That last one is also relevant to all the protections. Retaliation is protected under the Fair Housing Act. So if you retaliate against anyone for utilizing their fair housing rights or enforcing their fair housing rights, so you evict them because they make a fair housing allegation against you, that is protected and could get you into more trouble. So now we're going to move into just some general best practices as we wrap up this this morning, I should say, going into afternoon. So some best practices. The most important thing, if you get any key nugget of information out of these best practices, is have policies in place and apply to all. Have your policies and they need to be applied to everyone equally and consistently. So know your responsibilities under fair housing law, which laws apply based on where you operate. Are there local ordinances that apply? Establish application criteria, policies, and procedures that follow the law. Be evaluating your policies and procedures. Do any of them discriminate against anyone because of their protected class? Or are they applied differently to people that fall within a protected class? So have that evaluation as you're looking at your criteria, your policies. Is there a fair housing risk here? Because in the instance that somebody does file an allegation against you, you would have to, provide that evidence to say that it wasn't, or you've done your, what are you doing to say it's not discriminatory? Train management, maintenance, and other staff on the policies and your commitment to fair housing. So wonderful you guys are all here today. Having that fair housing training is a good risk management strategy. So step one, you've checked off a best practice. You're here today. Is everyone who interacts with potential applicants and current residents aware of their fair housing responsibilities and your established policies? So again, not just your leasing agents that are, continuously interacting with applicants and tenants. It's your management, your higher level management. It is your other maintenance staff, and maybe it's contracted staff. Everyone needs to be aware of policies and the commitment to fair housing and get training. All of those criterias, policies, and procedures need to be applied evenly and consistently across the board. Are your leasing agents or are your staff providing the same information about vacancies, waiting list qualifications, security deposits, credit, employment checks, source of income information, rebate specials, and policies? Make sure everyone is aware of the information and that they're providing it consistently and accurately. Make sure all tenants and applicants are equally aware of it. Again, consistency is key to compliance. Document your adherence to these procedures as well. Ensure housing choice. Housing providers should not make choices about which property may meet someone's needs. I kind of discussed this earlier. Again, it could be in really great intention. However, it is not your choice to make which unit meets someone's needs. And we often do see this with families with children and people with disabilities. They should all receive all the available information and they choose for themselves if it meets their needs. Consider requests for reasonable accommodations or modifications based on a person's disability on a case-by-case basis. And don't make an assumption about somebody's disability. A person's may request an accommodation for a disability, and you have had, there's somebody else on the property that has that same disability, but they've requested something different. It needs to be evaluated based on the person. These changes are necessary for a person to have that equal use and enjoyment of their home. Again, refer to those joint statements that we provided and linked in those slides. You can also find more information on our website. Familiarize yourself with local occupancy standards that apply to each property. Understand that housing providers only need to know the number of people in the unit. They don't need to know really much more. Don't be getting, don't be asking where people are sleeping and, that really intimate information. Occupancy policies should not be more restrictive than local standards. Is it following local health and safety standards? And then you can refer to our occupancy resources that were also provided as handouts and can be found on our website. Assure that the property and its amenities are accessible for individuals with disabilities. Ensure that their pathways, curb cut sidewalks are kept clear of obstacles and safe to use. And they're being clean property. We just got a lot of snow here. And so make sure that those are all being kept clear of, that obstacle of snow. We had to do so this week for some of our entrances. We had to, make sure that our accessible entrance was completely plowed and free of ice and snow. Ensure dedicated spaces for accessibility are usable. Again, just as I mentioned, don't have snow accumulated in the parking spots either, and don't store things in accessible stalls, things like that. Review advertising materials for fair housing implications before you publish or post. Again, describe the property, not the people. Advertise. Again, remembering that advertising is not just promotional materials, but verbal statements as well. And then if you have any questions, you're welcome to contact us. But again, when in doubt, just take it out. Now we're going to look at some application of the laws. I have some scenarios that we'll go over with some multiple choice answers. So test your brain based on what we learned today, and then we'll do some questions toward the end. We'll have a few more slides, but Almost there. Addressing specific housing situations armed with the knowledge of fair housing laws. Again, have policies in place and apply them to all. So I'm going to launch these. You can get your brain thinking about them while I'm pulling them. Oh my gosh, sorry. If you've ever shared your screen on Zoom, the little bar on the top is not ideal. Okay. The first one here, a 65-year-old male who has rented from you for 5 years just began using a wheelchair. He's asking you to make a reasonable accommodation for his disability by paying for a ramp so he can have easier access to his first floor unit. What would you do in this situation? It should be multiple choice, excuse me. It is a modification, not an accommodation. We have to see if a ramp will fit in the space out front. He should use the door off the back deck instead. How we are funded impacts who pays. This is not a reasonable request, and I need a letter from a doctor stating that he has a disability and disability-related need. How would you proceed if, your tenant of 5 years just began using a wheelchair and asked you to make a reasonable accommodation and pay for the ramp so he can have access to his first floor unit? And I don't think we mentioned this, and I apologize. These polls are anonymous, so please answer them. It's really for the benefit of you. We want to make sure that you're understanding the material that we're providing today. The second one here, a resident who uses a rollator works with you to have ramps installed at her door and the common area where other residents and visitors use. She requested that you maintain both ramps. What should happen in this instance? She needs to maintain both ramps herself. We will maintain both of the ramps and charge her a fee to do so. She needs to maintain the ramp at her door, and we will maintain the one in the common area. Neither ramp needs to be maintained. So because these are a little bit more lengthy, I will give a little bit more time on this, but everyone is coming in with those answers, so thank you. But I'll give about 30 to 45 seconds to answer these questions. Again, they're anonymous, so please answer to what you think is the best answer. Okay, I'm seeing most people answer these questions. I know some people are still getting their answers in, but for sake of time, I do want to move forward. So I'm going to end the poll now. We will go over the answers, so don't you worry. So for the first one, with your 65-year-old tenant who's asking you to make a reasonable accommodation for his ramp and pay for it, what would be the way to go? Well, first, it is a modification and not an accommodation, so that is right. And then it would be appropriate to see if the ramp will fit in the space out front. There is, some special math that needs to be done for ramps, and so that needs to be considered. And then also seeing how you're funded impacts who pays. So you may have to pay for it if you receive federal funding. So that, that is, again, I will keep reiterating, know how you're paid or how you're funded, so you could do so. However, it would not be appropriate for you. So the bad answer is the not what you should do, would open you up to risk. Don't suggest them to use the back door instead. Again, they are asking to use the front door, and they would like their ramp to be on the front door. Um, and it is reasonable, in a sense, again, it depends on how the funding is paid, but it is reasonable for somebody to ask for a ramp. And then you would not need a letter from a doctor, because you can see there he is a person using a wheelchair. So a letter is not needed because the disability is known or obvious, and the disability need is also known or obvious. For the second one here, the resident with the rollator had both ramps installed, and she wants you to maintain both of them. She would need to maintain the ramp at her door, and you would maintain the one in the common area. So I agree with the 73% of you, that, that's how that situation would look. For the one where, because the next biggest one answer we had was that you will maintain both and charge her a fee to do so. If you offer to maintain them both, that is really great on you. However, you cannot charge her a fee to do so. It is very clear that people with disabilities should not be subject to fees for their disability related needs. So that would be, you're charging her a fee to have a ramp is what is happening. So that would be kind of how that situation would look. Okay, now we will move to our third and fourth one. Okay. Several weeks ago, maintenance orders were submitted by 3 Latina tenants. You notice the more recent orders submitted by white tenants were addressed instead. The repair orders from the Latina tenants appear to have been ignored. What would you do? Talk to staff to learn more, provide training about equal treatment. It depends on the types of repairs, and there is no fair housing risk here. The second one, you got an application for a vacant unit from a Black couple with 1 child. After they leave, the white man next door stops you and asks if he can lease the unit for his son because he doesn't want you to rent it to somebody who isn't white. What would you do? Take the application from his son, process the family's application because your policy is first come, first serve, document everything that was said, take the son's application ahead of the family, and call the Fair Housing Center. Again, I will give a minute here for folks to get that answered. Okie dokie. Get your answers in. I'm going to end the poll here and share those results. Thank you. I did notice in the chat, somebody was questioning why in the last scenario, why the tenant didn't maintain both ramps. Because the other ramp is for like the common area and it's being used by everyone. It would make the most sense for the housing provider to maintain it. I just wanted to provide that clarification. So several weeks ago, maintenance orders were submitted by 3 Latina tenants, and then there were other orders that were submitted by white tenants that were addressed instead, and the other ones were ignored. So talk to staff to learn more. That is a great first step because kind of going to the other one, it depends on the types of repairs. So if you talk to maintenance staff and learn that the types of repairs, we're dependent on parts coming in, things like that, that would change how that situation looks. However, I will want to add that if it is because of, parts coming in, things like that, it's really, really important to make sure you're communicating that because if those tenants were aware that there was difference of treatment, that their repair orders weren't addressed and the other ones were, that on the face looks as if there was difference in treatment there, and they would have the right to file an allegation if they found that out. So it's really important to provide that communication if there is parts coming in or delay due to whatever the reason may be. And then the other thing would be to provide equal treatment. I would not agree with there is no fair housing risk here, because from what we were given that information, there's some difference of treatment here. For the next one, with the vacant unit, where an application comes in from a Black family, and then the guy next door who is white tells you he doesn't want you to rent to someone who isn't white, and gives you his son's application, the best process to do would be to process the family's application, because your policy is first come, first serve. Document everything that was said. You are welcome to take the application from his son. If his son is wanting to turn in an application, follow your process and take that application. However, if your policy is first come, first serve, you process the family's application first, document everything that was said, and you can call us as well, as there may be, if there's harassment that may happen in the future, it's important to have that documentation and to let us know in case, that family moves in and there's further issues. Okay. Then we have two more, and then we will be wrapping up, and I'll try to be quick on these because I know we have a little bit more, so this may be a little bit quicker. A family of 4 is living on the property in 2-bedroom unit and has a baby, their 3rd child, making them a family of 5. The unit is 949 square feet and holds 4 people according to local code. Their lease is not up soon. What should happen? Begin the paperwork to make them move out. If they do not ask for a larger unit, they should not be forced to relocate. It is usually reasonable, to give the family at least through the end of their lease, and even up until the child's 2nd birthday, to vacate the premises, and then consult local ordinances, fair housing information. The second one, you are reviewing an application from a young couple with 2 children. They appear to be qualified, but you notice that the wife is a convicted felon who has just spent the last 3 years in state prison. What should you do? Automatically deny them, and it depends on what the property's policy says. So I'm going to, again, make this a little bit quicker due to time. I'll do about 15 more seconds here. People are pretty quick to answer these, though. Oops, sorry about that. Okay. I'm going to end the poll and share the answers here. For the first one, if they do not ask for a larger unit, they should not be forced to relocate. And additionally, it has been reasonable, found by case law, to give the family at least through the end of their lease and up until the child's 2nd birthday to vacate the premises. It has just shown, small children don't take up much space, so that is kind of what case law has kind of pushed forward. Consult local ordinances, and fair housing information as well. It would be pretty risky to begin the paperwork to move them out, and there would be some fair housing risk there to do so. If you're reviewing the application from a young couple with 2 children, but the wife is a convicted felon, it would be the best response would be, depend on what your property's policy, look at your property's policy, rely on that, and automatically deny them without reviewing the policy, or the individualized assessment could open you up to fair housing risk. So great work there, folks. And then I'm just going to quickly go through what testing is. Testing is an investigative tool used to gather evidence. Volunteer testers simulate an ordinary housing transaction for obtaining credible, objective information. And it can be used to investigate all types of housing and housing-related services. It's a scientific measure of difference, and it's getting the information on the quality of information, content of information, and the quantity of information. It's looking at the availability, the price, terms and condition, information exchanged, and treatment. So are people getting difference of information? There's a clear separation of roles between enforcement staff and testers. Testers receive 3-hour training. I believe that's now a 2-hour training. That hasn't been updated. I apologize. Conduct practice tests and receive follow-up training. Objective rather than subjective standard. So there's standard forms and a narrative. It's all objective, not subjective information. And there's no contact between testers. Testers don't know the other person. It's very individualized. Testers and also do not know what they are testing for. They're given the information and then they go out and do it. And then it is evaluated by looking at side-by-side comparisons. So looking at one here, we have tester 1, which was a African-American tester, and tester 2, who's a Caucasian tester. And then you can see that they were given difference of information in the availability. They were given difference of information in the wait lists here. So the black tester was told there was a long wait list where the white tester was not told that. Rental rates were also different. Credit, the black tester was asked for a credit, background, and income check, and the white tester was only asked about a credit check. The white tester was told about, the amenities around the property and offered a cable package, where the black tester was not. So this is why we're very pushy on making sure you're providing consistent information and that everyone is providing the same information, because by looking at this, there is a clear difference of treatment here. There was a few questions on the Fair Housing logo. It is available online. Please put this where it is appropriate. It indicates to the public that their property is available to everyone under the Fair Housing Act. There are specific requirements for size and location, so you can find that online. And then there is that Fair Housing poster, which you can also find online and to put up in your common areas. These are just some MSHA links that you can utilize for more resources. Here are our resources. We have lots of information, so feel free to check those out. If you want to learn more about source of income, we will have a training in January in the new year. So you are welcome to register for that, and that is linked there on the handouts. And then, if you really enjoyed our work, your financial support is crucial to our ability to continue to provide this information. So feel free to check out information on becoming a member. We would love to have your support. And thank you for attending. We really appreciate you being here today. The evaluation and attendance verification should open up. If not, it is here and will be provided in the chat. Sorry about that. And every person attending must complete the survey separately. So please, if you're attending as a group, each individual person must complete that and provide the accurate information. Please provide the correct first and last name and the correct email that this will go to, because verification will only provided to those who complete the survey. And that, again, they are not physical certificates anymore. We are sending email verification, so that information should be accurate. So thank you so much. We appreciate you being here, and we will look at some questions if we have any more. Doesn't look like it, so feel free to put some questions in the chat. Otherwise, feel free to log off if you have everything you need, and thanks for attending today.